Right, so hi everyone. Welcome to Latest Halftime Club, where we speak about the practice spectrum. Now, this might be a topic a lot of you may be familiar with, depending on the courses and workshops you may have attended or something you may have read online. And hopefully, what we're going to do today is bring it a little bit more to life, a little bit more detail around some different topic areas to hopefully support you in your setting. Go out and explore different ways we can use different practice types and what the benefits and the trade-offs may and may not be. So as always, we have our workshop breakdown. So we're going to look at what is the practice spectrum. We can look at the idea that there's many spectrums out there and there's also many choices to pick from within them. The impact of the practice spectrum on technical development with players. Practice selection and its impact on coaching behaviour, and how coaching behaviour can also impact our choice of practice selection. How we can connect practices together. We look at the idea of a practice within a practice, and some final considerations when coaching. So as always, we open up the floor with a question. So you'll see at the top of your page a Q&A button if you haven't been previously on a Halftime Club before. And the first question will be, what is the practice spectrum? So what do you believe it to be? What have you seen or heard? What have you used so far? So if you could just use the Q&A function or the chat function and just put in some of your thoughts. What is the practice spectrum? So Christopher shared the different types of training we may do with our players. Jason's not heard the term before, but imagine it's the range from simple passing drills through to traditional games. Yeah, it's a good idea about the use of the word range there. Thanks, Jason. So Pierce has showed the different methods to approaching the practice, how we might make it fun, how to get the most out of a topic, how to progress or simplify. Glenn said it's my first attendance at one of these sessions, so instead of use of the word spectrum is limited, maybe it's the difference of progression or difficulty or complexity of drills. Yeah, thanks for attending, Glenn. Nice to have new ones on. Join the Halftime Club. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to move on now to the next bit. We're going to start to address this question. And what I'm going to show you on the screen, some of you may be familiar with and some of you won't, and that's fine, and we'll go through it anyway. So what is the practice spectrum? So a practice is an activity that you use in your session. So there are different practices, and these different practices will impact a player's behaviour in differing ways. So a spectrum provides us with a sliding scale to recognise when to change and adapt the practice we select based on the needs of our players. So what we're saying here is you may pick a certain practice, but there are lots of different types of practices, and we move up and down this spectrum to select what we think is the best to support the needs of our players. Now, for those of you that are familiar with the practice spectrum, a little interesting fact that through coach education pathways over the years, there have been a multitude of different practice spectrums that have been used in coaching courses over these years. And what I'm going to show you is two of them on the next couple of slides, and we can look at these in a bit more detail. And we're going to look at when we say detail, I don't mean complexity. What I mean is you're going to look at it in a simple way, but to hopefully help you support your players and their needs, which is what we always come back to when we speak about the choice of practice type. But we're also going to highlight today how, as a coach, we can have an impact on the practice selection, and I'll be aware of why that might be. So the current practice spectrum that's used in the current qualification pathway, whether that's Introduction to Coaching Football, the UEFA-C, for example, will cover around this basic theme. So at the top is an arrow left and right, and the reason that arrow goes left to right is that links into that sliding scale I spoke about previously. And what this framework and model says is that if you go towards the left-hand side of this model, you're probably working at technique more than skill. If you go to the right-hand side of the model, you're looking at skill more than technique. Now, technique is generally described as the mechanics of an action, where skill is generally described as the application of it. However, sometimes these words and terms can get blurred depending on where you read information online or when you go on course and qualification. But currently with the FA Education pathway, that's the description and definition they use. So if we look below that, you'll see they're split into 4 different areas. So we have unopposed practices with interference, overloaded practices, and matched up practices. Now, an unopposed practice is what it says in the tin. That means there's no opposition, no interference that will impact upon a player's choice of behaviour. And we're also probably going to argue that the player's choices are limited within an unopposed practice because there is less going on for them to interact with. So as an example here, we're saying 2 players passing between themselves, or a passing game with no interference. That could be like a passing square or a passing pattern that some of you may be familiar with using. If we look to the second part, unopposed practice with interference, this means there's still no threat on the ball, but there is a bit more variety going on that the players have to contend with, which may challenge some of the technical stuff they've worked at previously. So if you think about passing backwards and forwards, we may now be passing at different angles, in different ways, at different speeds, at different heights, using different surfaces. So all of a sudden what we're doing is we're interfering with that sort of basic level of technique, the mechanics, to try and hopefully make it more variable, add more variety, which probably looks more like the game. In the third bit here, we have overloaded practices. So this could be a 4v1 practice. So we're giving lots of success to the team that's overloaded, probably less success to the team that's underloaded. But actually, depending on what we want to achieve within our practice, there may be a clear rationale and intention behind doing that. And then finally, we have our matched up practices, which is your typical game-based activity, which is 8v8, 5v5, 2v2, 3v3, for example. So that means there's equal numbers on both teams. So the next practice spectrum I'm going to show, and this one you may not be as familiar with depending on the time period in which you completed your qualifications. So this is covering around the idea of constant, variable, random, and you'll see them words sort of stuck in the middle there in white with the red text. And this was terminology that was used previously to describe the sort of actions that players may practice within a session and how we can scale them up gradually to look more like the game. So on the previous slide, we spoke about variation, increasing variation when we spoke about unopposed interference. And this is just speaking about the same thing. So when we use the word constant, variable, which is talking about variation, and random, which is complete variation, it's just very similar wordings, very similar definitions, but just delivered in a different way. I'll break down the constant, variable, random more in a moment, but if you just look here, we're speaking about on the left-hand side, we've got low decision making, and on the right-hand side, we've got high decision making. And when it comes down to practice design, we probably are always thinking about decisions and how many decisions we want the players to make versus how many decisions you want the coach to make. So the general argument is that with a constant practice, which we'll break down in a moment, or an unopposed practice, the coach is leading the decisions the players are making. With a practice where there's more variation, more randomness, or more game-like, the decisions fall onto the players. Now, this doesn't mean that a low decision-making practice or an unopposed practice is a bad thing, and we have to be conscious of saying that and cautious of saying that, especially with what we read online. Sometimes you can be led to believe that it's something you shouldn't do. However, if a player is struggling with something, we may want to slide up and down the scale to different degrees to support that player based on what they need to work at. But the key thing here is they're both highlighting the same thing. But what I'm now going to do is break down constant, variable, and random. And we're going to look at this in a hopefully really simple way. So where these terms come from a skill acquisition background. So I'm not going to go too much into that sort of scientific or academic stuff, but it was just a way to describe that when every time you do a skill, let's say you're doing passing, you're either changing each time you're doing a pass or you're doing the same thing constantly. And that's where the idea of constant comes back. So we're thinking about within skill changes rather than between practices. So we're looking at what they do in that moment. So again, there's a sliding scale up and down here, depending on where we want to pick. So constant. So I've got this padlock as a sort of analogy, a metaphor for this. So all constant means is we're practicing the same things under the same conditions. So going back to the slide that we had the first one, which you may be more familiar with, the current education pathway around unopposed. An unopposed practice without any interference is probably going to be working at the same things under the same conditions. And there may be some reasons we do that. So it might be because we have an individual that's really struggling with the mechanics of striking a ball. And if we put them into too much chaos, they're not going to get lots of opportunity to practice that. So doing a constant practice may increase the amount of repetition a player gets, which may benefit them feeling more confident, which may benefit them thinking that they're working at something, which all these psychological things that go with that. Now, probably what it's not doing is getting them to be prepared for playing in a context where there's lots of variability and lots of randomness. But it doesn't mean it hasn't got a place. We just have to understand what we're losing and what we're gaining. Variable, it's like where the padlock's slightly unlocked. So the padlock's still there, but we just unlocked it a little bit. So in terms of an example, that kind of means we're doing the same things, but with different conditions. And that links into your unopposed interference. So we could be working at passing consistently on the floor to feet, however you want to describe that. But we may change the angles, the heights, the speed, the tempo, the direction, the surfaces we strike the ball. So majority of people probably work within the variable setting because that's where they get to have a bit more of impact coaching. But then the final setting, where other people can work where they're doing more game-based activities, is generally around the random. So that means different things, different conditions all the time. Now, there's a lot of interest in this side of the spectrum now because people, speak about game-based activities, but we have to consider what we're trading off. The more game-based our activity, the more decisions players have to make, which means the more likely or the less likely they'll have contact with the ball, the less likely they'll get to practice the same things repeatedly, and it actually could impact on confidence. So it doesn't mean, again, that it's either wrong or right. It just means you have to be conscious that if we constantly play games, we may be limiting players in practicing things they need to practice. Vice versa, if we always do constant practice, we may be limiting their experience to survive in randomness, survive in chaos. And a world nowadays where there's lots of information, lots of chaos of young people and adults to contend with, we have to be able to prepare them to survive in all these aspects. So this little bit at the bottom here, less decisions possibly on the left-hand side, more decisions possibly on the right-hand side. And you just think about coach-led decisions versus player-led decisions. So I spoke a lot here about information and how information might change between a constant practice where there's the same thing, same conditions, with a random practice, different things, different conditions. And I want us now to consider these things. So using the Q&A function, can you list some of the information that is present within the game that players must contend with when making decisions? So I gave an example before about sort of that randomness of different angles, different speeds I may have to pass at. So just think along them lines, what information in the game may players have to contend with when they make decisions? So use the Q&A function or chat box to populate your responses. Cheers. So David shared position of the opposition. Brilliant. Yep. Good start. Good start. Should start flowing now because there'll be loads and loads of stuff you can think of. I'd like to think. Condition of the pitch. Brilliant, Jason. Yep. Weather condition. Yep. Stage of the game. 100%. Position of teammates. Distance from the goal. Yep. Speed and weight of pass. Position on the pitch. Type of pass received. Yep. Scoreline. Yep. Your own position. Parents. Yep. Shouting from the sidelines. So some external influences and impact. Yeah, whether we need to pass through, around, or over. Yep. Emotions, 100%. Thanks, everyone. Keep populating that chat, and I'll pick out some bits as we go through. The rationale behind this question, and I knew there'd be lots of responses on this, and I'm going to sort of move on to the next bit where I've listed a few. And by no means this is an exhaustive list at all, because as we said, there's loads of stuff we can speak about. But all of this information we've just spoke about in the chat has an impact on the technical development of our players. If we truly believe that technique doesn't just happen in isolation, that it's something that's always a consequence of the things we're interacting with, then we actually need to consider what information we want players to interact with, depending on when some of their technical side or their skill breaks down. So, for example, if I can observe in a game that a certain player does a certain action and it tends to not be as effective in these certain moments, it probably means I need to think about that information that present in that moment could be having an impact on what they're doing now. So, for example, if I have a player that's really effective at passing backwards, forwards in an unopposed practice, and they go into a game and it breaks down because there's a lot more chaos going on, it probably means I've jumped too much information too soon. And I need to find a middle ground, which might lay within that variable practice. It might lay with that unopposed interference. It might lay in that overload practice, underload practice. So hopefully what I'm trying to bring to life here is the needs of your players. The observations you make as a coach is going to have a massive impact on the practice design and practice selection you make. So I've just listed, yeah, it's not an exhaustive list. It's listed a few different things here. So players are moving, direction of pressure, speed of pressure, intensity of pressure, the task they've been given to do, they've got to contend with, players' skill level, their own ability, what they value and don't value. Do I like dribbling? Do I like passing? Communication, scoreline, the consequence. If I lose this game, what's the consequence? Or all these things. Or if I do this wrong, blah, blah, blah. Positioning, fatigue. Again, there's so many different things that players have to contend with. And we have to be really conscious that not all players are going to be aware of these things going on. There's knowledge about the game where we teach them about things we can point out on the pitch, but there's also knowledge of the game. And knowledge of the game is stuff that people don't know they're interacting with. And this is the sort of stuff we're speaking about. They don't always aware of the position. They can't actually tell you about it, but they're just doing it. So what this then sort of follows on to is this sort of question here. And I'd like to think the majority of you have experienced this to some degree, because I definitely have myself. So have you ever delivered a practice where the players appear to gain a lot of success in the practice and it made you feel as a coach that, yes, they're getting this. You go into a game and all of a sudden it just breaks down. They don't do anything you've just spoke about. I would like to think this scenario happens quite often. I don't know if you can use the react function and put a thumbs up if you agree or thumbs down if you disagree. But in my capacity as a coach developer, I definitely see this quite a lot. Now, what this is essentially, I'm getting towards here, is we think back to the last slide, it's probably broken down because players have gone from having to contend with limited or few pieces of clear information, and now they're contending with so much more dynamic information. It's ever changing, or it could be completely new and they've never experienced it before. So essentially, the two practices that we've done, the first one we've done when we thought they're getting lots of success, and the next one they're now competing on or practicing in, are completely different. And the players are now overloaded with information. And that is where we then go back to the practice spectrum and we consider the fact that actually it's a sliding scale. So if we just work down at unopposed practices and jump straight to matched up, we could be overloading the players with too much information too soon, and that's when it's more likely to break down. So there may be a practice we need to select where they live in between that, where we essentially were saying we're gradually going to increase the difficulty, we're going to increase the information that players have to contend with, so that we can prepare them to get into our desired performance environment, which is the matched up practice. Because the reality is, when we go into a game, we can't make it unopposed, we can't make it overload, underload, deliberately at least. We can't control that. So we have to prepare them gradually to get comfortable to be able to survive in a matched up scenario. So hopefully that sort of makes sense. So again, on this one, there's no constant variable random, but that links in the same. If I'm doing a constant practice constantly and I go straight into a random one, information's different, difficult to always contend. But it doesn't mean every player will have that. Some players will be fine at jumping, but it just means you've got to keep a watchful eye on the players you're supporting, because they may need to live in a different position within that practice spectrum. So the next question, and that links into you as a coach. So I want to take away from the sort of player perspective at the moment, unless you feel that's beneficial to the question. Why and when do you as a coach feel more comfortable delivering certain types of practices? So why and when do you feel as a coach more comfortable delivering certain types of practices? Use the Q&A function or the chat room. Thanks. We've got familiarity. Yep, great point. We've done a version of the activity before. Yes, you've delivered the session before, team responded well to it. When you've planned and prepared the practice, have a good idea of the outcome you're trying to reach. David said about depend on the stage of the season. Yes, depending on the age group you support, you may have a pre-season that might look very different, or it might be middle of the season. It could be fatigue. When confident with the topic or the group, form of the team can influence it too. See if there's any more responses. Okay, perfect. Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to narrow some really great responses, by the way. I'm going to kind of narrow down to some research that was taken a while back, and I won't go into too much detail, but there was a massive study that was collected regarding the impact of coaching behaviours and practice selection, and what sort of practices coaches were more likely to select depending on experience and things like that. So There is evidence to suggest that coaches are more comfortable coaching within unopposed practices compared to within the game. Now, by the way, I'm not saying this is the case for any of you on the call, but this is what the research was suggesting. And I've got why here, and the reason why is because what the research found out was that coaches that were earlier in their journey were more likely to select unopposed practices because they had complete control over everything the players complete within that practice. And it was easy for them to see what the players were getting better at or getting worse at. So the unopposed practice, because there's less information to contend with for the players, it also meant there was less information for the coaches to contend with as well. And I think we just have to be cautious that everyone's on their own journey, their own stage of learning, their own stage of experience. And it's not to say that because you are coaching unopposed practice, that means you're a bad coach. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what it means is we just have to be wary of the fact that if we're doing more of this, is it because we feel more comfortable with the less information that's going on with, dealing with less chaos? Now, on the flip side of this, sometimes we also see, and this is something we see more often now, is coaches can also prefer to select practice sides that are more game-like in nature, but then actually often do less or limited coaching within them. Now, for those of you that may have read some things online around a game-based approach or anything like that, a game-based approach doesn't mean you don't coach. A game-based approach means that you are really good at observing what the players are doing and how they're interacting in all that chaos, and supporting them with questioning, supporting them with a break. We might have a debrief. We might brief them some things we need to consider. But what it requires you to do is to be a brilliant observer and a brilliant understander of the game. Now, in my capacity as a coach developer, I've supported people and they put on a game and they cross their arms and do nothing. That's still not coaching. You're facilitating them playing a game, but if you want to help them get better, just by putting a game on doesn't mean you're a good coach. So what I'm trying to allude to here is no matter where you sit in terms of comfort within the practice spectrum, it requires you to have a different skill set as a coach to support the players. So if you think you do more on a pub because you feel more confident and comfortable with the element of control that it brings to your players or yourself, that's fine, because that might just be where you're at this moment. But then what you've got to consider is how you slide up the scale as a coach yourself. So you don't want to just go from unopposed practice to games because you might struggle to see the information that's relevant. It might be that you do an unopposed practice interference, you have a lot of variety within it, but you still got that element of control. But what you're getting better at is seeing variety, and you just slowly edge up that scale. So sometimes we don't speak about this on workshops enough, is that the coach's competency and the coach's comfort in the practice they deliver. But hopefully I'm just bringing that to life a little bit. And that's just what we call here. So your level of experience, your knowledge, and where you're at in your journey will impact where you feel most comfort coaching so far. So it's just really wanting to reiterate, if you prefer more games, that's fine, but it requires a very different skill set around observation and understanding the game and principles of play. If you do more unopposed, it probably doesn't require as much ability to understand the principles of play, but it does mean you have to take more control and take the stage for that practice. You have to go in and own the stage when you take an unopposed practice. Okay, so moving on there. So I hope that got a little bit of thinking going on for yourselves and maybe where you think you sit mostly. So next question, Q&A function or chat room. How might we connect practice together to create a whole session? So we spoke about practice in isolation at this moment in time. We spoke about doing unopposed, or we've speak about doing matchup or constant variable random. How might we begin to connect these practices together to create a whole session? Because you don't want to do, for example, an unopposed practice for the whole hour. And so try and describe to me in the Q&A function chat room how you might connect certain practice together and in what way. So David said about progressing through the practices. So I'm assuming, David, you mean like going from sort of unopposed interference, etc. Stuart spoke about working along the spectrum, following a theme, unopposed pass to start with, and a small game, but with emphasis still on passing. Jason spoke about using conditional games to integrate unopposed interference drills into match play. For instance, practice drills on crossing becomes a conditional game with unopposed wing areas marked out. Then it's about progressing along the scale of information, level of opposition. Like I said about creating an unopposed practice that encourages the technical elements of the unopposed practice. Benjamin said about using whole part whole. Thanks everyone. So what we'll do, we'll move on and we'll go through a couple of ideas that are promoted on courses and workshops regarding how you might connect some practice together. I think before we get onto that as well, so there was quite a bit there about progressing up the scale. Now, we don't have to start on the left-hand side and end up on the right-hand side. We can start at any position we feel that's necessary. So what I mean by that, for example, if we have players that are competent at passing unopposed, what is the point in them working at unopposed for another part of the session because they're already competent at it? So what we need to do is then scale up the information and difficulty to get closer towards the performance environment, which is the game. Now, that also doesn't mean that players have to be competent unopposed before they can go into a game. Doesn't mean that at all. It just means that if we need to visit a technical or unopposed element, it's because the players are really struggling with interacting within more complex and more chaotic environments. So again, it's not to say you have to start down here and go up there, but it's a sliding scale. You can position anywhere you want. You can go up, you can go down. Just depends on your players and their needs. And obviously, I'm not privy to your own context. So quite often, this is one that most people probably heard about: warm-up, technique, skill, and game. So technique, skill, and game is essentially constant, variable, and random, just in a different name on. So technique would be generally you're unopposed. Skill would be we had a bit of variation within that, maybe a little bit of opposition interference, and you go into your game, which is your matchup activity. So that you might be familiar with, and generally that's called up the ladder. There may be warm-up, whole, part, and whole. So now Benjamin mentioned about whole, part, whole. And the whole part, whole method can sometimes be misunderstood. What it doesn't mean is just play a game, do nothing, do a practice, and just do a game. It's actually a very deliberate practice, a way of organising practice together by saying we're going to do a game with a specific topic, a specific outcome. We're looking towards the players to practice, which allows me as a coach to observe the things that I need to observe based on the theme that I planned. So, for example, if I want to see how good people are at winning the ball back, I might put on a game and say to you, if you win the ball back within 5 seconds and score, you get an extra goal. But I'm deliberately doing that whole so I can work out what I then need to do in the part practice to help them get better at the whole. So the reason is you start big, take a part out, put it back in, rather than just a game, do whatever you want and go back into a game. Not to say that's wrong, by the way, but there's a bit of a misinterpretation on that way of organising a practice. So the part bit would then be, if I'm doing the press one, for example, I might put them into smaller groups and work out what behaviours we want them to do and detail and stuff like that. And then we place it back into the game with maybe the same condition on that we had in the first game, and we look to see if there's been a change or an improvement or change in understanding of what we've been speaking about. Another one is warm-up carousel game. So I've really simplified this. So a carousel approach is essentially multiple practices in the middle that players rotate around. And then the assumption is that we can then fit them and piece them back into the game. So it might be you take the strikers out the midfield and you might rotate them different places. It might be you have a passing, a dribbling, a shooting. There's all these different ways of doing it, which includes multiple practices. So again, there's no right or wrong here. It's just, do you have a clear rationale and understanding of why you're using them? It might be that if you want to engage players, you might do a whole part whole because they know they're coming to a game and they're going to roll in. But you just have to ensure as a coach, you're still considering that it's not just a hands-off environment. You can still have an impact on the players and what they're doing in that game to support you and your observations. So this is just a couple of ways to connect practices together. I think something that's not on here, and I think key to consider, is we're speaking about connecting practice together within one session, but we can also think about how we connect multiple sessions together over a period of time. Now, learning doesn't happen because of time. Learning happens because of the quality of experiences. So just something to consider that, one session doesn't necessarily mean learning has taken place. It might require a multitude of practices, a multitude of sessions with lots of good experiences for the players and yourselves for them to improve at a certain area. So just something to consider. Next thing we're going to look at is a practice within a practice. And we've kind of highlighted this in some of the chat room regarding maybe we can have certain things within other things. I'm just going to give an example. So there may be occasions where we want one or a few players to work at their technique, for example, whilst the other players are working at different things. So we might want one person to do same conditions, same things. We want other people to work at different things, different conditions in the same practice, which can sometimes be difficult to plan and organise, because then that kind of in our head might mean we've got to do two different practices. But as mentioned in the chat box, actually we can be really clever and deliberate with our design of our practice within that practice spectrum to have two things going at once. So we do this by blending two practice types together. So what I'm not saying is you've got to have two different people delivering two different things. We can actually be really smart with this. And we're going to provide an example. And this example, by the way, is just my example. It is not the way, it is just a way of looking at it. So I have two wide players that find it difficult to combine from wide areas when under pressure. So I've made an observation on the match day, for example, within training, and I'm now going to build a practice from this. So therefore, I have placed zones on the pitch that these players can stand within to receive without any pressure being able to be applied. And the reason I've got three different zones on each side with a gap in between is they can change zone, but they take the risk that they can get tackled between them. So what I'm not doing is giving them complete freedom to have no pressure at all, because we all know players that will just pick up the ball and just run all the way to the goal without any pressure, which may cause it difficult. But if you receive in a certain zone, then you have to act within that zone. If you leave that zone, people can act on you. So the wide players are tasked to combine within 3 seconds. So the reason I put that second condition on is because I'm not saying within touches. I'm saying that yes, you can still change zone you're within, but you must do it within 3 seconds, or you must combine. Again, this is not saying this is the perfect way, just giving a really simple example. So depending on their ability, we can adapt this practice to increase the challenge level where needed. So I may change the size of the zones. I may change the rules after 3 seconds. Someone can come and engage with them and try and take the ball off them. So therefore, within this practice, we have combined both an unopposed practice with variable outcomes. So we're doing same things, different conditions, with a matchup with random outcome, which is different things, different conditions. So all players have been supported within one practice. So as a coach at Grassroots, that's a thumbs up, because it means I haven't got to break loads of different sessions. I haven't got to use too many cones, too much equipment, but I can be really clever with how I design a practice to bring to life some of the needs of my players. Now, it's not going to be possible to support every person's need at the same time. So you may only pick 1, 2, or 3 people to support at a time that you may need to be really clever with in terms of how you design the practice. So that, again, that sliding scale, I've got different practice types within the same practice. Now I'm going to pose the question back to yourselves in the room. So can you now think of how you could create a practice within a practice for one of your players or your team's needs? So some of you may already have done this, and that's brilliant, and I'd like you to share that on the chat room or the Q&A function. If you haven't, start to think about how you could have a practice within a practice for one of your players and teams. I'll give you another example. It might be you have a circle in the middle of the pitch that you want one of your centre mids to receive in without getting tackled, so they can practice receive on the half turn. So hopefully we'll just give you some different ideas. So have a little think and play around with that and share some of your thoughts or ideas in the chat. So Richard said about he practiced with our midfield that if receives from a right winger, he tries to switch to the left wing. So that would be sort of the same thing but different conditions, because in a game obviously that won't always be on to do. So that's an example of something like a variable practice within a larger scale. Good. So Mike should have a player who takes too many touches, doesn't move the ball on. Create a practice where he's the magic man on the pitch, tasked with facilitating play. So yeah, you could argue then that would be a same task, different conditions. So because you ask them to do a certain thing, but in the moment of lots of chaos. Chris shared about setting individual targets for your players to achieve whilst the practice is taking place. So think towards the practice design more than the conditions and challenges set. So just think about how you can actually have a practice within a practice. So just based on, maybe I didn't ask the question as well as I thought, just based on some of the responses, I think we're going down a slightly different path with what we're sharing. That's fine, by the way, that's more on me. So using David's example here, I'm currently working on switching using the goalkeeper. So we had this as a bonus scoring condition in the game. Now, what if your goalkeeper's not getting success at switching? So even though you've added a reward for your goalkeeper, if that happens, or switching using the goalkeeper, if we don't get success at it, how are we going to change the practice design to allow them to get success? So rather than change the challenge or change the condition, how are we going to change the practice design within that spectrum to create a practice within a practice that may allow them some success? Yes, David should have broken this out to work on the players involved, possibly. Yes, but it could even be within that same practice that you could even have them start the practice every time. So it could be unopposed until they practice that bit and then they go live. And then they could have opportunity then to practice it with a bit more chaos when it comes back again. So you could have you could start with something unopposed that ends up straight into something opposed, for example, that's sliding up that scale. It might be that you have a overload in that part of the pitch for the team that's building out and you have everyone else away. So again, they've got a higher chance of getting success. So that'd be using low overload practice within a matchup practice and quite deliberate with it as an example. It could also be that you have the pitch split into different zones. There's all these so many different things, and just trying to get you to really think about loads of different ways we could do this within the same practice. Let's have a look at the Q&A. Yeah, so different starting positions. Yeah, so different starting position essentially is same thing in different place, different conditions. So if I start from there, I know I'm probably going to practice the things I want. So if I want to work at throw-ons, for example, if I always start with a throw when it goes off the pitch, no matter where it goes off the pitch, or if a foul's given, it's a throw, then you're going to get lots of opportunity to have a variable opportunity to practice something. And then once it goes live, we're back into a random game, for example. So essentially, yeah, with your practice, but you're just trying to bring to life and elevate certain aspects more, but without having to necessarily separate all the players into different practices all of a sudden. So that practice within a practice is a really clever way. And hopefully that, I'm conscious that I'm in my head that makes sense, but trying to get it across. Hopefully that just, if you put a little thumbs up and react, if that makes sense, what I'm trying to go towards here is that there's so many different ways you can design a practice to have different people working at different things at the same time, and they don't even realize it. Perfect. Cheers, everyone. Right, okay, so thanks all. So moving on. So we're sort of coming to a close now. So just some consideration. A lot of these are very familiar to those that have been on the call before. So we always want to meet the needs of our players. So that should be the reason why we pick practices. But I think as well to consider, we spoke about meeting the needs of the coach. You know, if you feel more confident and comfortable delivering a certain type of practice, see if you can slightly slide up that scale just a tad and put yourself out your comfort zone and to see, because I had a conversation the other day with a coach developer that was supporting someone in the professional game, for example. And they said, "Oh, yep, we can sign you off now." But they said you're not quite comfortable delivering these different ways. So they made sure they supported them through these different ways to ensure that they were as well-rounded as possible, so they could deliver as much of different things as possible to hopefully then benefit their players in different ways. So you think if that can happen at the highest level, you can also practice it at the lowest level as well of the grassroots game, which is fundamentally more important because that's most players are interacting with the most people and most volunteers. So yeah, really, if you feel yourself doing one more than the other, give it a go and try different things on that scale. Um, you know, as there, so the importance of trying to coach within different practice types, give it a go. Let the players explore, let them show ideas to you too, because they may come back to you and say, look, we don't enjoy this way of doing a practice, and that's fine, you know, as long as it's done with the needs in mind of the players. But there's also sometimes the players might actually, so needs actually mean wants the players. Sometimes they might need a certain thing. So it's getting that communication between players and coach, which is important. Providing encouragement is hard to try new practice sometimes, and this isn't for the players, this is for you as coaches. It is hard to do something different if you've already delivered a practice in a certain way. It's hard maybe if you've got a certain belief about how you should coach to try something different. But again, the best coaches are those that can coach anything and everything. And have fun trying things out. Have fun, definitely try things out. Right, so a little workshop summary. So we looked at different practice spectrums, unopposed interference, overload and matchup, which is the more prevalent one currently at this moment in time in the education pathway. We also looked at pre-existing spectrums regarding constant, which is same thing, same conditions, variable, same things, different conditions, and random, different things, different conditions. We spoke about the importance of scaling up the information at the right time or scaling down, depending on where the players are at, rather than just sort of jumping from unopposed to the game and then expecting why things haven't sort of worked out. Because we spoke about the information being too chaotic and too different compared to what they previously experienced. So that practice selection and the impact on technical development is really key. Practice selection and coach behavior, you know, yourself, your knowledge, your ability, your experiences, where you are so far in your journey, will have an impact on likely have an impact on the practice selections you make, and just be conscious of that. Different ways to organise practice into a session. So we looked at up the ladder, we looked at whole part whole, we looked at a carousel approach. We also spoke about, you know, working outside of simply one session, speaking about how we can connect practices and sessions across a length of a period of time, but also reminding ourselves that learning doesn't happen over time. It happens because of the quality of experiences that our players participate in. So whole part whole, yeah, up the ladder, which is technique, skill, game, carousel, and then finally a practice within a practice. So yeah, thanks everyone. So that sort of closes up. So just a couple of things just to make aware of for those within Essex. So August, so we've delivered the practice spectrum today, and we had the disability specific effective practice design workshop. We do have a workshop next Monday night, many practices, many ideas in Chelmsford, which looks at how we might break a pitch down into different ways and different shapes and sizes. And we have some future workshops, especially more leaning towards October here, around designing effective practices. Building a finishing practice will be the next half-time club, and then there'll be an incorporating goalkeepers workshop as well, practical. So yeah, a little break between now and October now. So the next workshop will be building a finishing practice from scratch, and how we can best support players who want to work at finishing, not simply just do it unopposed. 25th of October, midday till 1. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Hope that was beneficial. Great to see some new attendees to the Halftime Club. Hopefully you are regular visitors going forwards. Quite lower numbers today, but I recognise everyone's on holiday as it's summer holidays as well. So I do thank you for attending. Cheers. Thanks, everyone. through text